All right, so everybody, thanks for coming. My name's Jesse Sanders. I'm the CEO and founder of BrieBug, and I'm an Angular, GDE, and web technologies expert. So you can reach me. This is my real email address, jessesanders@briebug.com, or you can reach me out on on Twitter at jesses_briebug, and happy to answer any questions that you might have. All right, so NgRx, who's using NgRx right now? Awesome. So NgRx, as you guys know, just had a birthday. It's 3.5 years old. So I think that's huge. So what's crazy is it has now over 800,000 downloads each and every month. So we have a lot of people using it, a lot of great stuff going on with NgRx, and I'm excited about it. I love using NgRx, use it in projects all the time, and we're going to talk about NgRx, some advanced concepts, and some things that you should be doing, and maybe some things you need to stop doing. So, rules of thumb. When NgRx was announced a couple of years ago, what we started seeing is people would just jump in and start using NgRx on everything, from their to-do apps to their tour heroes, and they're just going a little crazy with using NgRx. So one of the recommendations is to start simple. Maybe not actually use NgRx right out of the gate, because you probably actually don't even need NgRx for a lot of your projects. I know that might be a shocker to you, but if you use some very simple patterns, you can upgrade from, let's say, something like service with a subject into NgRx when you need it, and you don't have to pay the price up front for it. So update later to NgRx instead of maybe right out of the box starting to use it. That's really good advice. You're going to save yourself a lot of time. And then really the main concept with NgRx is we want to reduce complexity. And if we start out a project and we're not quite sure if we need NgRx, we're increasing complexity unnecessarily so. So one of the big things that I see people doing right now is they are subscribing to everything. Okay, who's a victim of this, right? Yeah, you know who you are. And who won't raise their hand no matter what I say, right? Yeah, exactly, I know who you are. I see you out there, yep, yeah. So stop subscribing. That's one of the biggest things that we see is that we're calling services, we're working with observables, but we're subscribing to everything. Okay, and even worse, we do something like this. Who's done this, right? Where I subscribe and then I do some stuff and it returns a new observable. I subscribe to that when it's just changed. How do you test this? You know how you test it? You don't. This is really difficult stuff. So if you're writing code like this is what you need to stop doing. And we need to start looking at some real basic patterns on how we can write effective applications using NgRx or similar types of state management. I'm going to move this because otherwise it is going to jingle and you're going to hear it the entire time. All right. So who's using Container Presenter right now, or Smart Components, Dumb Components? Okay, that is, look around. That's like less than 10% of you. So if you are using NgRx and you're not using Container Presenter, I'm going to ask that you reconsider. Okay, Container Presenter is one of the easiest ways that you can simplify your components and simplify your NgRx implementations, as well as be able to implement some of these other patterns like service with a subject and be able to do so very gracefully. All right, so let's talk about containers really quick. So containers interact with the store. They're the brains behind the operation, and often they are your top level, like page or feature level components. Okay, so they interact with the store, they pass observable data via the async pipe. So the whole thing about stop subscribing, async pipe solves this for you. Who's looked at the code for async pipe? Anybody? A couple of you? Okay, even less people, great. So if you go look at the code for async pipe, all it's doing is it's resolving that observable stream and then unsubscribing for you so you don't have to do it. You don't have to worry about memory leaks. You don't have to worry about the complexity. Okay, so it's going to receive events from child components. So what do I mean by this? So often what happens is we'll go ahead and write components, and I'm sure this is none of you, where we write a component and it works great and we want to then use it in another little area. So then we just have a little switch statement or an if statement, right? We just say, hey, if this variable exists on this session service over here, then I want the component to do this. Otherwise I want it to do that. And then you come along, you add a little bit more, you're like, oh, this is great. I'll just add another if then else. Okay, cool, great. And then the next guy comes along and says, hey, I'm just going to change this to a switch statement. And then we come along and we look at it, and this what beautiful little simple component now has this massive decision tree on how it's supposed to interact, right? And then so I come along looking and go like, wow, this is a great component, but I'm going to rip out all this stuff. I'm going to make a copy of it, and I'm going to have now 2 copies of the same component. Don't do this. By doing the container presenter model here, I can actually eliminate that by deferring. So the child component will just go ahead and emit events back out, and then the parent can decide how they're going to work, how that interaction is going to happen. That's going to give us more reusable components. So containers get to do all the decisions about where the data comes from, how it's being loaded, what's going to happen when something's clicked on, or whether it be a system event or a user event, how are we going to do things. So here is an example of a dashboard component that is a container. So you can see here I've got a heroes variable of an observable stream of hero array. I've got my hero service coming in, and I've got on my ng on init, I'm setting my hero observable equal to the hero service get top heroes. Okay, notice there's no subscribing. I'm not trying to resolve this. I'm going to allow it to be an observable stream. If that stream gets updated, my container is automatically going to have that updated data, and then it's going to pass it automatically down to the child via the async pipe. And here I've got an event handler on hero clicked, where it's going to receive the hero, and we're going to go ahead and navigate or whatever decision that we're going to do with this hero. So our HTML here is very, very simple. This is where we're going to wire up our child component, or what we're going to call our presentation component. And here you can see that we're passing down heroes using our square bracket notation, and we're unwrapping it using the async pipe. Again, no subscriptions, nice and clean. It's going to go down to that child component is just native hero array data, right? And on the on hero clicked event, we're going to have that be handled by our function, or I'm sorry, the hero clicked event will be handled by our on hero clicked local function. Okay, that's the basic premise of a container. Very, very simple. So talk about presenters. What are presenters there for? Really, presenters are also what are known as the dumb components. They're there to just really honestly make things look pretty. They don't understand where data comes from. It just sort of kind of comes from the sky, and they receive it and they go, oh, thank you, I've got hero data. That's fantastic. Let me make it beautiful. When somebody clicks on a hero or does some sort of interaction, it doesn't actually decide anything. There's no decision trees inside of our presentation components about what to do. It's going to just kindly take that and say, hey, somebody clicked on a hero. I don't know if anybody's listening, but I'm going to go ahead and emit an event back out. And whoever's listening, here's the hero that was clicked. Do whatever you want with that. So presenters are very, very simple. What happens here is by doing this, we're now creating highly reusable components that are very, very easy to test, that have no logic in them. And we're doing this basic concept of defer, defer, defer. So here I've got my top heroes list component. I've got my input. I'm receiving heroes as hero array. Again, no observable stream. I don't have to unwrap anything, subscribe to anything. It's nice and simple. I'm also declaring an event emitter here so that I can go ahead and raise events back out. And I've got on my hero click, I'm going to go ahead and emit that data out. And let me just see if I can make this a little bigger here. There we go. That way I don't have to keep looking back over my shoulder. Excellent. And back over here. All right. So that's our presentation component. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is service with a subject. So often I hear people say, hey, NgRx is really complicated. I don't really want to write a bunch of actions and reducers and effects. And I kind of want some state management, but I don't know what to do. So they end up taking shortcuts and they do really bad things. instead of doing a good pattern. So one of the patterns I want to talk about today is service with a subject. Anybody doing service with a subject now, currently? Okay, not very many. If we look around, a few hands up. All right, some people aren't going to raise their hands, right? That one guy over there, he's not going to raise his hand no matter what. All right, so service with a subject is a very simple concept. Here I've got a user service that I've defined, and I go ahead and create a private member variable called $, and it is as a behavior subject. Anybody know why we're using a behavior subject versus a regular subject? Okay, yep. Got a lot of great answers being tossed out there. I definitely heard, I think you said over here, the difference between a regular subject and a behavior subject is, with a subject, if I show up to the party late, the party's over. There's no data. I don't actually get the value. With a behavior subject, it'll go ahead and hold on to whatever the last value was. So it doesn't matter when I show up to the party is still raging. We're good to go. We're rocking and rolling, right? I've got some data. So in my case here, with my behavior subject, I'm going to go ahead and initialize it. I'm saying it's of type user array, and then I'm initializing it to an empty array. So that first value that someone's going to get is just going to be an empty array. And I then create a property getter here, just called user $, that returns an observable user array. And the key here is I want to go ahead and then take our behavior subject and return it as observable. And this prevents people from doing some crazy, silly stuff where they might decide, hey, I've got the behavior subject. I'll go ahead and next another value and modify the stream. We don't want that to happen. So we use something like as observable. This is not required. This is a preference. I think it's a good idea. Depends on what type of developers you're working with and what types of systems you're trying to create. So our case here, now we've got our load all method. Instead of load all returning this .client, HTTP client get, now it just makes the call. And with our HTTP client call, we're calling get, we're expecting a user array, and we're calling API users, and then we're subscribing to this. Now, before anybody jumps up and says, hey, you said don't subscribe, right? Well, this is the one exception here. I can go ahead and do a subscribe, and because it's the HTTP client call, it actually auto destroys this and unsubscribes to this, and so I don't have to worry about managing that. In this case here, I want to go ahead and subscribe to it so that I can get the data that was returned, and I can go ahead and add that to my behavior subject stream. So who's heard, that's in a nutshell, that's what service with a subject. So let's talk about if you are going to do NgRx. Who's heard about actions, right? Everyone knows about actions. And did anybody remember Mike and Brandon up on stage during one of their talks? And it was like, actions are the gluten of the NgRx loaf. Or one of my favorites here is that it's the mattress of the NgRx bed. So actions are the critical aspect here. And it's something that we see a lot of people start to take shortcuts in. It's a really bad thing to do. No shortcuts. If you're going to take shortcuts, I'm going to recommend some other libraries to you, some ways that you don't have to worry about actions as much. You can take advantage of the library and not do something like this, where we have a single action that does everything. Anybody do this? Nobody should be raising their hand, hopefully. But where they have a single action, let's say called update users, and we have our reducers do all sorts of stuff. We're manipulating data using our lovely subscriptions, and we're making changes and morphing our data. And then we just have this single action that says, hey, now go ahead and update the users with this. This is a real world example, actually, from a client that we looked at. They couldn't understand why they weren't able to really get NgRx to work and work well and be able to track what was going on. And once we started breaking it down, it's like, well, how are you expecting to track it? You've only have one action. So you really need to start thinking about actions as really being a three-part deal here. So 3 interactions. One is, hey, I'm making the request, go load users. And then I've got 2 additional ones. And this is what I'm describing here as a basic CRUD operation for you. So go load users. And then we have either load user success or load users error. Okay, so we have 3 different states that we're trying to manage. In the load users, I'm actually going to then say, hey, clear out any existing users that we already have from the store. Go ahead and set loading to true and set errors to nothing. when the data comes back, then I'll go ahead and set loading false, and I'll add the users to the store, and if an error occurs, I'm going to go ahead and set the error, right? So don't take shortcuts. You're actually going to find that it's going to cost you more time and more effort to debug and figure out what's wrong with your application when you decide to not be verbose in your actions. So selectors, who's actively using selectors heavily now? Okay, who doesn't use selectors at all? Nobody? No one's going to raise their hand to that one? Okay, so selectors are really where the power is within NgRx. So with selectors, once we have the data in the store, now we can create new slices of state using selectors. Why are these so powerful? One is because they're composable, and the other one is because they're memoized. So composable means that I don't have to write one big selector routine to get my data mapped out the way that I want. I can actually chain them together, one selector after another, creating various inputs, and then be able to get my data into a format that I want. And then memoize says, hey, that's great. Once I have a calculated value, and as long as the store hasn't changed, when you ask for getting the total of something, it's automatically going to bring it back to you. We don't have to recalculate it at all. So we're getting some caching there. So selectors are great for doing any sort of mapping, sorting, filtering, anything that you need to do within your application. Once you have the data into your store, then you can do some manipulation. Now, when I say that, I don't mean go load your entire database, put it into your store, and then use selectors to do it. That's not a good pattern. It's a very bad anti-pattern. So one thing that people often don't know about is if I have a selector called select total, and it returns a memoized value of 8, and let's say select total is actually depending on both an order store and a product store. And something changed in products, but the order store didn't change at all, and the selector is actually based on orders. Then every time I ask for select total, it's still giving me 8, even though it should be 9 now, or 10, or whatever that new calculated value is. And so something that a lot of developers we see struggle with is they don't know about this thing called release. So if you're having an issue with selectors and you're in the case where you're getting a memoized value and you don't know why it's not changing, even though a related store has changed, you're going to need to manually call the release on that. That's something good to have happen oftentimes in, let's say, like an effect, so that when you make this call or you make this change, then you want to go ahead and release that selector so it's no longer available. So, all right, nested data. Who's had to deal with nested data with NgRx or within their applications? So this is one of it doesn't seem like a really bad thing to deal with, but it actually creates a lot of problems, a lot of complexity. So one, it's a bad practice. So when we have nested data, what we often have is duplicated data. This is actually a talk, by the way, this is my second time here at AngularUP, and this is one of the things I talked about last year was nested data with NgRx entity. And so what happens is for us to be able to update this data, we have really bad reducers. And what I mean by bad reducers, instead of having a single 1 or 2 line sort of reducer that's really easy to test and understand, I have this really big mess of a reducer. And what happens is that it's really easy to mutate that data. And we mutate, if we're not using something like the store freeze, we may not realize this till much later, often usually in production in a really bad situation, right? So we want to go ahead and break data up. So in this case here, I've got what would be a blog article. And I've got a couple of blogs defined here, and it's got an author attached to it, and then I've got my title, and I've got some comments. So I've got really 2 different types of authors or users of the system. I've got Jane and Bob here, and both have written a blog article, and then both of them have made a comment. And you can start to see here that we've got some duplicated data. Okay, now if Bob actually now decides he wants to go by Robert, now we got to go find all the different places that we have Bob stored in our store to get that updated. Okay, not a real good practice. Also, if I try to just update Bob's comment down here, I can't just change the comment out. The entire object is going to have to we're going to have a new instance of that. Otherwise, we're going to mutate it. And then also an unexpected of that is now any components, if we have a large nested component structure, then all those components are going to have to re-render as well. So we start to run into some performance issues there. So what I would suggest to you is prefer to go ahead and break these apart. So now I've got blogs and I've got users, and I can go ahead and make references to those. So it works pretty nice. This in itself actually still, you're going to run into some problems. And so one of the next things that we're going to talk about is NgRx entity and why that'll actually help you solve this problem. So with nested data, we want to go ahead and split nested data apart for the store. So you can do this in the service itself on the subscribe. You could do this in your effects. You could do this in helper functions. Any one of those three, it's fine. It doesn't really matter where you do it at. Do what's going to work best for you and making sure that you're not repeating yourself. So dry concept there. And then when we go to actually put the data back into our components, we want to then reassemble the data using selectors. So this often means then we need to create a new model that actually reflects the data together, so that we don't have to pass down separated data and having to do a bunch of different selectors, that we'd actually want to have a selector that would pull the data out, put it into a new view model that we could pass directly to a component. All right, so this leads me into NgRx entities. So NgRx entity, anybody using NgRx entity currently? Wow, not a lot of hands. This is probably the #1 library that I would suggest that you start to take a look at in terms of if you are going to use NgRx, you should be using or at least considering NgRx entity. Now, if your data is very, very simple, we're not dealing with array-based data with IDs, like, we're just doing some to-do lists, or we're doing just let's say UI configuration sort of data where we're not having to deal with that, then you don't need to use NgRx entity. But NgRx entity, if you're loading data from an API and you're dealing with arrays of objects, then NgRx entity is going to save you a lot of time and a lot of headaches, and it's going to allow you to do this relational data on the client side with very, very little work on yours. So with NgRx entity, it prefers dictionaries over arrays. The fasts are super fast because, or the finds are super fast because it can find the data by the ID, and I don't have to go, do some sort of index filtering, looking over the entire array, trying to find a product ID that, has 1, 2, 3 for the ID. It's got built-in methods for how you take array-based data and make it dictionary-based data, and it also comes with selectors that allow you to take it from dictionary-based data and put it back to array-based data so that you can use ng4 and other directives like that. What's interesting about this is I was looking at the stats last night. So we've got 800,000 downloads of NgRx a month, but we only have approximately 322,000 downloads of NgRx entity. So this tells me that we have a lot of people that are not using this, and you really should be, okay? Save yourself a lot of time, a lot of headaches. So let's take a look at how that data is stored. So here we've got blogs, and it has 2 properties on blogs. Notice there's no array here. So I've got blogs and I've got entities within that, and I've got IDs. So we'll start with IDs. IDs is actually the list of IDs in the natural order that they came in. So when we go to use our selector, it's going to enumerate over the IDs and say, hey, give me the one that's got an ID of 1, give me the one that has an ID of 2, and it's going to recreate our data in the same exact order. This isn't as big of a deal if we're wanting to just sort by numeric ID order, but if we're doing something that's more using GUIDs or something similar, or a different sort order, we need to maintain this. So that's where that comes in handy. And so you can see here we have key value pairs. Our key is our ID, and our value is our actual object here. So this is our blog object. Now notice I have an author ID of 1. So now using my selectors, I'll be able to get a list of users. It's going to have a structure very similar to this, and I can say, hey, give me the user, square brackets, 1, boom, I've got the exact user I need. I don't have to enumerate over anything. So let's say you don't want to actually do NgRx fully, and NgRx entities might be still a little bit too much work for you, then one of the things I'd strongly suggest to you is take a look at NgRx data. So this is an implementation built by John Papa and Ward Bell, was announced about a year and a half ago at NgConf. So I guess a little over a year ago at NgConf. So this allows us to do a simple configuration to declare what our entities are, and it's going to do all the heavy lifting for us. So it's built upon NgRx entity. The data is actually going to store itself in the same, using NgRx entity underneath the covers, but all you're going to have to do is interact directly with it as a service from your component, and you're not going to have to know anything about actions, reducers, effects, none of that. It's automatically going to happen for you. So I like to call this is kind of like easy NgRx. Okay, you don't have to do a lot of work. And then when you're ready to upgrade or you want to kind of eject out of this, it's very simple to do so. All of it's overwritable, and there's great documentation out listed in the README. So what does it look like? So here I've got a hero component. If I want to go ahead and do an add, I just call my hero service add and give it the hero. That's going to go ahead and place that into the store. Same with delete, it's going to remove it. I can now make calls to go get data, and that's going to put data directly into the store, so then I can go get that data back out later. So it's really simple interactions using services that are also, in large part, they're going to extend an existing service, and most of this code's going to be really underneath the covers for you, and you're not going to have to know how to use it. So this is a great way to start projects up and get things going very, very quickly. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is NgRx schematics. So NgRx has its own schematics. The other one, if BrieBug, the company that I own, we created some schematics called NgRx entity schematics, and this is going to generate out a whole bunch of code for you that includes your model, your effects with tests, your reducer with tests, a service, a bunch of selectors. So it's going to do basically everything that you need for CRUD operations, and you're not going to have to write a lot of code. So if you want to be a little bit more explicit and have actions and be able to modify this stuff, this is a great route to go. If you want to be a little bit more implicit, NgRx data is a great way to go. We also have another thing that we've been working on, it's experimental. We've been working on this with several projects, and it's called NgRx Auto Entity. And this actually allows you to use generics where you can say, hey, I want to do a load by ID, and using my angle bracket, say I want to load customers. And it has a whole set of CRUD operations available to you. It's kind of an in-between between doing NgRx data and doing schematics and being very explicit, and something for you to check out if you're interested. All right, here. So let's move on to NgRx Facades. Anybody using Facades currently in their applications? So a good friend of mine, Thomas Burleson, wrote a great article on Facades that I highly recommend for you to check out. It's very similar to Service with a Subject. Basically, the idea is that we can remove our NgRx implementation out of our components and move it into the service. This also, by using Facades, when I move from Service with a Subject to NgRx, by using Facades, actually my components don't have to change at all. My components can stay exactly the same. So this is your upgrade path. So if you're thinking, hey, how do I go to NgRx without paying the price up front? This is exactly the roadmap for it. So it hides that NgRx implementation. So here I have a facade called the user service. You can see I've got a function or a property getter here where I'm getting my observable, but instead of pointing to a behavior subject, I'm using my store and I'm using a selector to get all users. And then you can see I'm injecting the store here. My second slide that's related to this is now my load all function. Instead of it making a direct call to my HTTP client to go load the data, it's just going to dispatch a new event to say, hey, load all users, and the effect is going to go ahead and pick that up. Okay? So NgRx facades are going to save you a lot of time, especially when you're deciding between service with a subject and then moving up into NgRx, which, by the way, you can have applications that are intermingled with both. Use NgRx on your most complicated pages first, the ones that you're trying to manage complexity and you're trying to deal with really tough timing issues. NgRx is perfect for those. You can go ahead and upgrade those to NgRx and then just update your facades, your service with a subject, to this facade pattern, and you're done. Your components don't have to change at all. Most importantly, what I want you to hear is I want you to find a tool that works for you. So some people are going to say, hey, don't use NgRx data, don't use this, don't use that. Don't worry about that. Don't take shortcuts. Find the best tool that works for you and your team, and be as efficient as you can in building your applications. Make sure you've got a clear line of sight to your upgrade path so that things are going to work well for you. So we got a couple, we're going to run a minute or two over here, so we're going to hurry. For NgRx testing, Jest.js is my preferred library for doing this. It's super fast. I get to run fail tests first, and snapshot testing is the way to go. So here I've got a test that is testing my reducer. I've got my expectation there where I'm calling my user reducer. I'm giving it an initial state. I'm passing it my action, and I expect it to match my snapshot. So no longer do I have to manage what the expectation looks like and having to create object literals manually. Now I can actually just say, hey, compare it to the snapshot that was before to what it is now. If there's a change, then alert me and tell me I've got a problem. And then I'm going to manually go visually inspect those and figure out what's going on. Is this correct based off the changes that I've done? And these become part of my Git check-in, and they become part of my Git flow in the PR process. So this is perfect for testing reducers, selectors, effects. I can tell you with when you're testing effects, you're going to want to bring in Jasmine Marbles. We don't have time to cover this. We're running a little long here, but Jasmine Marbles allows me to go ahead and control asynchronous operations in a very synchronous way. By the way, I'll make all these slides available and I'll post them on my Twitter account, so you can have all these slides when we're done. Also with testing, if you haven't checked out Cypress IO, it's one of my favorite products to use lately. It replaces Protractor. It makes end-to-end simple. They're much more reliable, easy to test edge cases, and they're fast. It allows us to stub out the data that's being returned by our API calls. It's unbelievable. It's a bit of a paradigm shift, but you're going to go from having flaky, unreliable tests to tests that you can absolutely stake your life to, that they work and you don't have to worry about it. All right, last piece here I want to talk about. We're talking about actions. What I want to dig into here is that you've got really three types of actions: command, documents, and events. When we think about actions, here I've got an example of an effect, and the command is, hey, I want to insert a user. The document part of this is, hey, we have a user, go ahead and insert this into the store. And then I have an event that's handling a user error. So I want you to start thinking about, when you're creating actions, what type are they? Another aspect I want you to think about is different types of effects. So we're going to cover the first three very quickly here. We have deciders, splitters, and aggregators. I think aggregators are probably the most exciting. Here I've got an effect where it's getting with latest from, and I'm getting data back from the store, and if the user ID is this, then I can dispatch this action, or if the user ID is less than 0 or equal to 0, then I can do this action instead. It allows me to do some decision tree inside of my effects, and I can have one action here end up triggering another action instead. So splitters are very interesting. This allows me to say, hey, look, I want to have a single action here, and when that happens, I want it to kick off a series of actions. So I might use something like a flat map and say, when we want to load the admin user, I want to call load user by ID, and then I want to do a log operation. So we want to log who this user is that's requesting admin access. Okay, this allows me to split it off. These can now each have their own effects that are handling these, and have their own outcomes on success or failure. And then the last one here is the aggregator, which in this case, when we call load by our action of load user by ID, now I want to watch and make sure that I've got my success handled and my logged handled. Those would be my success actions from each one of those from the prior slide. And when those happen, I want to dispatch a new action called load admin user success. So what's fascinating here is, if I have a series of actions that I want to wait for them to complete before I kick off the next action, aggregators are a great way to do it. And with that, I created a bit.ly link here called AgOps, because you could use I use zip in my example, but depending on how you want it to interact, you can use fork join, zip, combine lattice, or with lattice from, and get different ways of how that data is being handled based on when the observables are firing. Last piece, if you haven't heard of LogRocket, go out and check it out. It allows you to record sessions. It works great with NgRx because it allows you to use a meta reducer to track what's going on with your users. It's free up to 1,000 sessions a month. You can recreate all bugs, even ones that aren't reported. You have all the data that they've been receiving. You actually get screenshots of and a little video of what was occurring, so you can no longer say, the bad part is you can no longer say, it works on my machine. Okay, you can actually recreate their error. If you go out to logrocket.com, you can learn more about it. Highly recommend it. Really cool product. With that, thank you so much. Great being here back in Tel Aviv.